Hello everyone, my name is Nathan Pfeiffer, and today I'm doing my final presentation on who I firmly believe is one of the greatest influential leaders of our time, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now, a lot like the rest of you, I think, when we began reading our autobiographies for this final presentation, I never really knew much about the Dalai Lama. I had heard of him, but I had never really researched anything that he had done. So I began reading his book, and actually up until today I was calling him the Dalai Lama, not the Dalai Lama as he is actually known as. So during today's presentation I'm hoping to inform the rest of you of what I have learned of the Dalai Lama, and hopefully prove to you what an amazing and influential leader he truly is, at least during our time, if not of all time. Let's begin. The Dalai Lama is known to be the spiritual and political leader of Tibetan Buddhism. The name Dalai Lama comes from the Mongolic word Dalai, meaning ocean, and Tibetan word Lama, meaning guru, teacher, or mentor. The Dalai Lama goes all the way back to the first Dalai Lama, Gendun Drup, in 1391. Now, when a Dalai Lama dies, or passes away, he is known to reincarnate himself, or be reborn as, another being, so that he can continue his work of compassion. There have been a total of 14 Dalai Lamas to date, who are believed to be the reincarnation of Avalokitesvara, who embodies the compassion of all Buddhas. The current and 14th Dalai Lama is Tenzin Gyatso, born on July 6, 1935. His real name is Lama Dondrup, who was born in Tokster in the northeastern area of Tibet. After the death of the 13th Dalai Lama, Thumten Gyatso, in 1933, Tibetan monks began looking for the child he was reincarnated as. Tenzin was later identified as his reincarnation at just the young age of 2 years old. Now, I'm not sure about the rest of you, but when I think of a 2-year-old child, I think of someone who is just growing into who they are going to be someday, beginning to eat solid food, and hopefully we can start to mold them into who we want them to be, and hopefully they can reach their goals of wherever they want to reach in life. But to be identified as the Dalai Lama means to trust this 2-year-old child to lead Buddhists. And I just think that's a lot of pressure to put on somebody who is as young as they are and impressionable as they are, which is why they do so they can mold them into the Dalai Lama that they want him to be. Now, at the time that he was identified, he was actually living in China. So the monks who came to his house and identified him as the 14th Dalai Lama had to pretend that they weren't actually sure if he was the reincarnation of the 13th Dalai Lama, as they were afraid that the Chinese government wouldn't allow him to leave the country. In the end, the Chinese government made them pay a ransom for Tenzin Gyatso so that they could take him to Lhasa in India to test him to see if he would eventually become the 14th Dalai Lama. Throughout his youth, he was brought up by the monks, as I said before, preparing him and molding him for what was to come during his life. At the age of 15 years old, before most of us were able to drive, he was recognized as the 14th Dalai Lama and spiritual leader of Tibet. During that same year, China began invading Tibet. Now that I've given you a little background on the 14th Dalai Lama, I thought I'd teach you a little bit about Buddhism. If you're like me, I had no idea what it really was about until doing this research. Buddhism is largely based on teachings of Gautama Buddha, commonly known as the Buddha. The name Buddha means awakened one or the enlightened one. Gautama is believed to have lived and taught in the eastern part of the Indian subcontinent. One of the most interesting things I found out while researching him is that his birthday and death date were never actually written down or anything along those lines. So we're not actually sure what time period he lived in, although we can make some assumptions. Two of the teachings of Buddhism that I would like to touch on today are karma and nirvana. Now, karma and nirvana both are intertwined because they both have to do with reincarnation. We'll be touching first on karma and then finally on nirvana. According to Buddhist beliefs, when one dies, they are reborn as someone or something new. What you are reborn as depends on the karma that you have accumulated throughout your life. I'm going to compare this to a video game, where you have to earn points to succeed. The more points that you succeed, or the more points that you earn through karma, when you die, you'll be reborn higher up on a ladder, whereas if you do bad things throughout your life, you receive bad karma, which means that you're more likely to be born lower on the totem pole, such as someone who is in poverty or even an animal. Some say that if you live a horrible life, you are most likely to be reborn as a cockroach. Now, nirvana is the ultimate goal of the Buddhist path. Reincarnation is said to be a punishment for the sins that you committed throughout your life, and you're just going to be reborn and reborn and reborn again. And depending on how much karma that you have accumulated, you'll either move up or down that reincarnation ladder. And once you have accumulated enough good karma, the stage of nirvana is reached, where you have reached a point where you are no longer reborn into the punishment of life. Earlier in this presentation, I mentioned just a little bit about China's invasion of Tibet. I'll be going into more detail on that now. In 1913, the Dalai Lama of the time expelled the Chinese and had independence from China for the next 36 years. Over this time period, China still believed that Tibet was a part of China. And in 1950, the same year that Tenzin Gyatso was recognized as the 14th Dalai Lama, China invaded and began occupying Tibet. Usually, this sort of advance would cause some sort of action from the rest of the world. But during the 36 years of independence, Tibet stayed separated from the world, as well as being neutral, so their independence was never recognized by the rest of the world. China issued statements that they were trying to help Tibet by issuing reforms to help the country, which was widely known as a backward country because of the technological advances that weren't happening during this time period. They promised to only issue and enforce these reforms if the Tibetan people asked for them, but China became famous for making and breaking the promises that they made to the Tibetan people. During the Chinese occupation, a slogan came about called "Smash the Four Olds." These four olds are the old ideas, old cultures, old customs, and old habits of Tibet. Before the Chinese occupation of Tibet, there were around 6,000 Tibetan monasteries. After the occupation took place, there are only 6 remaining. When investigating the types of leadership that the 14th Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso uses, I could have gone on forever. Because of this, I've decided to focus on just a few of his leadership styles, including proactive leadership, compassionate leadership, and empowering leadership. The first of the 3 that I'll be touching on is proactive leadership. The top 10 characteristics of proactive leadership are as follows. They think long term. They inspire others. They are great listeners and communicators. They are highly organized. They have great problem-solving skills. They seek advice and help when required. They are compassionate. They are loyal, and they have integrity-filled attitude. They have a calm demeanor. They know how to utilize team strengths, and they take criticism well. The Dalai Lama is a proactive leader because of how he acts on principle and not by acting on his feelings or on the situation at hand. This is made aware by how he acts peacefully when China invades Tibet and looks to change everything about the Tibetan culture through these reforms. Even when China begins killing Tibetans, he pleads his people not to act out in violence. Even after he flees to India, he tries to save Tibet's identity by working to educate refugees from Tibet who came to India about their culture and religion. In the next slide, we will actually see a video about the Dalai Lama's dedication to education. The second leadership style I'd like to touch on is his compassionate leadership. As the Dalai Lama, he is the reincarnation of the being of compassion. He is compassionate towards all people, especially his people of Tibet. He also urges compassion and respect for all living beings, including animals. The final leadership style that I'd like to touch on is empowering leadership. Many people look up to the Dalai Lama as he teaches others how to live life with happiness, peace, and compassion. There are many speeches online from the Dalai Lama teaching others his keys to happiness. Many I found on YouTube, and I thought about putting on this presentation. Unfortunately, they were recorded years ago, so they were quite hard to understand. But if you'd like to find them, you can easily find these speeches about his keys to happiness, as well as many other speeches given by the Dalai Lama online, as many of them are on YouTube. And without further ado, a video on the importance of education from His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama.
When a child is born, we do everything we can to protect them, nurture them, love them. A child's heart and mind are fragile. As they grow, we want to teach them everything we know. We send them to school to fill their minds with wonderful knowledge, to give them the tools they need for life. At school, they get a taste of what things are like in the world outside. There is friendship, romance, disappointment, embarrassment, discrimination, and bullying. But are the tools we give them enough to prepare them for this world? We have an enormous responsibility and an amazing opportunity. If we truly want to prepare them for the world outside, we must also educate the heart. Because to navigate the world outside with compassion, acceptance, and tolerance, we need to teach them compassion, acceptance, and tolerance. This can begin in our schools, and it can start today. It can happen at hockey practice, dance class, at day camps, and music lessons. And it's already happening around the world with astonishing results. If we want our children to grow into socially and emotionally capable young people, we must ask for a balanced education that puts importance on educating both the mind and the heart.
Although the Dalai Lama preaches for peace, there were some within Tibet who weren't quite so keen on being peaceful. After the occupation of Tibet from the Chinese army, they began taking away supplies that the Tibetans had saved for surpluses from the fields. Because of this, Tibet was actually put into poverty. The Tibetans began retaliating against the Chinese army and were forced to flee into the mountains, leaving their families alone, as they began fighting as guerrillas. As the situation deteriorated, the Chinese began taking out high-ranking Tibetan officials by inviting them to events at Chinese camps, and then they were never heard from again. Finally, on March 17, 1959, the Chinese invited the Dalai Lama to a performance at the Chinese camp just outside of Lhasa, where Tenzin lived, in a place known as the Norbalinka. Word spread of this invitation, and the people of Lhasa surrounded the Norbalinka and wouldn't allow the Dalai Lama to attend. He was aware that if kept up, the Chinese might take matters into their own hands. So he wrote to the Chinese saying that he would attend and was just being delayed. One of his cabinet members went ahead of him to the Chinese camp and began writing back to him, asking about his location within the Norbalinka. It became apparent, as seen by Tibetan scouts, who informed the Dalai Lama that the Chinese were planning on bombing the Norbalinka, whether he was inside or not, as they viewed mortars being placed around the city. The Dalai Lama knew it was time to leave, and so, disguised as part of the Tibetan army, he fled the Norbalinka. And within 2 days after he had fled the Norbalinka, the Chinese began bombing the Norbalinka, destroying everything in sight and killing thousands of people. With the help of the guerrilla army, he successfully crossed the Himalayan mountains and made it safely to India, where he began welcoming many refugees. The Dalai Lama has had mixed relations with the United Nations. The first was after China invaded Tibet, when they first began pleading for support. The United Nations turned down his request for support, mainly because Tibet never formally declared their independence to the rest of the world. Thus, they still thought of Tibet as part of China, and as an internal matter, they weren't going to interfere. On June 15, 1993, the Dalai Lama made an address to the United Nations. The following are excerpts from that address. No matter what country or continent we come from, we are all basically the same human beings. We have the same common human needs and concerns. We all seek happiness and try to avoid suffering regardless of our race, religion, sex, or political status. As free human beings, we can use our unique intelligence to try to understand ourselves and our world. It is very often the most gifted, dedicated, and creative members of our society who become victims of human rights abuses. Thus, the political, social, cultural, and economic developments of a society are obstructed by the violations of human rights. Therefore, the protection of these rights and freedoms are of immense importance both for the individuals affected and for the development of the society as a whole. The key to creating a better and more peaceful world is the development of love and compassion for others. This naturally means we must develop concern for our brothers and sisters who are less fortunate than we are. We need to think in global terms because the effects of one nation's actions are felt far beyond its borders. Respect for fundamental human rights should not remain an ideal to be achieved, but a requisite foundation for every human society. All human beings, whatever their cultural or historical background, suffer when they are intimidated, imprisoned, or tortured. We must insist on a global consensus not only on the need to respect human rights worldwide, but more importantly on the definition of these rights. There is a growing awareness of people's responsibilities to each other and to the planet we share. We are witnessing a tremendous popular movement for the advancement of human rights and democratic freedom in the world. This movement must become an even more powerful moral force, so that even the most obstructive governments and armies are incapable of suppressing it. I strongly believe that individuals can make a difference in society. Every individual has a responsibility to help move our global family in the right direction, and we must each assume that responsibility. In conclusion, Today I talked to you about the Dalai Lama, from the first Dalai Lama to the current Dalai Lama. I informed you about Buddha and the ultimate goal of all Buddhists, nirvana. And finally, I talked to you about a few of the leadership styles that are used by the current Dalai Lama, including proactive, compassionate, and empowerment leadership. I hope that I have helped you become more knowledgeable on this amazing human being. And I hope that you agree with me now that he is definitely one of the most influential leaders of our time, if not of all time. Thank you so much for taking your time to listen to me ramble today, as well as the rest of the semester. I look forward to your comments in the discussion and just hope that we can have an amazing conversation with each other. I hope that you have an amazing Christmas break, as well as an amazing second semester. Thanks again.